শুভ সন্ধ্যা সূচি উদয়ময়িক আলোচনা চক্র বিশেষ পর্ব দ্বিতীয়তে সকলকে স্বাগত জানাই। Good evening to everyone. Parampara SUCHI initiative, a special lecture by Professor Saurabh Dube. We are here for discussion upon history, anthropology, and rethinking disciplines. Today's session will be presided over by Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay. Saurabh Dube is an Indian scholar whose work combines history and anthropology, archival and field research, subaltern and post-decolonial perspectives, social theory and critical thought. After teaching at the University of Delhi since 1995, he is Distinguished Professor Researcher, elected as Distinguished Category in 2009 at the Center of Asian and African Studies at El Colegio de México in Mexico City. He is a member also of the National System of Researchers, Mexico, in which since 2005 he holds the highest rank. He was born to anthropologist parents, Professor S.C. Dube and Professor Leela Dube. He received the BA Honours and Master's degree in History from St. Stephen's College, Delhi, an MPhil from University of Delhi and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. He has held visiting professorships several times at institutions such as Cornell University and the Johns Hopkins University. He was elected to the D.D. Kosambi Visiting Chair Goa University in 2017. He has also been elected Fellow of the Johns Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, New York, the Institute of Advanced Study, Warwick, the Stellenbosch Institute of Advanced Study, South Africa, the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Shimla, the Max Weber Kolleg, Germany, and the Institute of the Human Sciences, Vienna. His research explores questions of colonialism and modernity, law and legalities, caste and community, affect and entitlement, and popular religion and subaltern art. Apart from around 130 journal articles and book chapters, his authored books includes Untouchable Past, Stitches on Time, After Conversion, Subjects of Modernity, as well as a quaint in historical anthropology in the Spanish language comprising Sujetos Subalternos, Genealogias del Presente, Historias Esparcidas, Modernidad a Historia, published by El Colegio de México. A 600-page anthology of his writing in Spanish, El Archivo y el Campo, was also published by El Colegio de México in 2019. Among Dube's more than 15 edited and co-edited volumes are Post-Colonial Passages, Historical Anthropology, Enchantments of Modernity, Ancient to Modern, Handbook of Modernity, Crime Through Time, Unbecoming Modern, and Dipesh Chakraborty and the Global South. He has also edited many important volumes and essays in Spanish language, which is a very special characteristics of Professor Dube. He is a great master in Spanish too. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you.
Today's session will be presided over by Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay, who is the former Nurul Hasan Professor of History and formerly Dean of the Postgraduate Faculty of Arts, University of Calcutta. Professor Bandyopadhyay's specializations on economic history, environmental history, history of science and technology of modern South Asia has enriched us many more times. He was the UGC Fellow under the Indo-French Cultural Exchange Program at Maison des Sciences. He was invited as a visiting fellow of the Department of History and the Department of Cultural Anthropology and the University of Uppsala, Sweden. He is presently as the Historical and Archaeological Secretary of the Asiatic Society, Kolkata. He has also been the secretary. He was also been the secretary of Indian History Congress from 2009 to 2012. He has published many articles on various facts and of economic history and enriched us with some Protestant histories. Some of the books he has authored: The Story of Jason and Company, The Agrarian Economy of Tamil Nadu, History of Gun and Shell Factory, Science and Society in India. And he has edited many more volumes and books. Among those, there are some very important volume with B.B. Chaudhuri with articles evaluating new issues of historical relationships of tribes and forest in India. He has also edited in Quest of the Historian's Craft essays in honor of Professor B.B. Chaudhuri. We welcome you, sir, too. So it is our honor to have Professor Dube and Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay in our session today. I welcome both of us. Sir, please unmute.
Should we begin our Adda in the very beginning, because we have such a guest like Professor Saurabh Dube,
Absolutely.
and we have such a subject as the relationship between history and anthropology. And Saurabh is actually working. I know him for many years. I am familiar with his articles and books for long, and I had chance meeting with him on several occasions also. So since the organizers have allowed us about 10 minutes time to have a chat with you on the very interesting and sometimes vexed relationship between history and anthropology. So I will begin with some of the questions. First of some observations and then some questions, and mostly questions which I'm sure that you will enlighten us to a great extent. The observation is this, that I know that you are from the very beginning influenced equally by the writings of history and anthropology, not only by your family tree, but also by your training. Some of your earlier writings actually show very important evidence of this dual relationship. In my case, actually, I was mostly trained in history, and while I was doing my first archival research, I had the chance meeting with Kathleen Gough. And Kathleen Gough at that time actually was one of the persons who came to, I think, anthropology via sociology, but she had great respect regarding the historical method. And she told me as early as 1974 that there are many people who believes there is no place of history or historical method in anthropological studies at that time, but she was an exception. Later on, when I found some of the debates which are going on, I found that this particular aspect was very, very important. So my question today would be this, that as particularly social historians, we know that the relationship between history and sociology is very important, but at the same time, very vexed. First of all, my question would be to you that take the example of Clifford Geertz. Why historians of various generations are so much interested to understand Clifford Geertz, particularly from the 1970s onwards, not earlier, when actually he had that Parsonian influence in 1959, etc. not that time, not that thing, but from the 1970s onwards, particularly that famous thing that, that deep play, Note on the Balinese Cockfight. So we want to hear more about it from you now, because this Balinese cockfight is something actually which is coming to us time and again, and we know that so many historians have taken so different positions, and as well as not only historians but also people like William Roseberry, for example, who wrote that Balinese cockfight and the seduction of anthropology. So we want to hear more about it from you because you know it very well. So
your voice is breaking. Should I start?
Yeah. Just Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay has asked you about
Yes. No, I don't know if he's
yes.
finished or if his voice.
Okay.
This is the trouble with these technologies. No, thank you very much for the comments, Professor Bandyopadhyay. And I will be touching upon the aspects of what you've already pointed to presciently. That is the relationship between anthropology and history as being important. Social historians recognizing that the relationship between history and importance is important, but also a very vexed one. And I'm glad you brought up my mother's friend, Professor Kathleen Goff, who was in some senses exceptional. Well, in many ways exceptional, not just in relation to not just in relation to the way in which she saw the importance of history, including in her book, which came out later in her life, on Kerala and matrilineal, but also, in terms of the courage and fortitude she showed. And many people don't know that Kathleen Goff lost her job at the University of Chicago because of her protest against the Vietnam War. And I bring this up, because often we forget aspects of the terms and textures of politics which exist around us, which surround academe, and we think that they're at some remove, but actually, I would ensure that the disciplines are shaped by wider terms of politics, which acquire intimate textures within knowledges. So thank you very much again. Now the question of Clifford Geertz is really significant. I'm so glad you've asked it because my talk, as you'll find out, as you will hear, is a kind of a survey over the last 140, 150 years, or even more, of this vexed relationship, this productive but vexed relationship between history and anthropology, and their mutual suppositions, their mutual propositions, related to questions of colony, empire, enlightenment, romanticism. As a result, I would not be able to go that much into the importance of Clifford Geertz. I do mention it. But what is significant is the following, and it relates to the comments which you made. What is significant is the fact that for Geertz, what is significant is that, for the cultural historian, Geertz became very, very important in the 1970s, mid-1970s, late 1970s. There's the work of William Sewell, particularly, but this is when historians were moving towards anthropology. And I remember when I was doing my master's and then my MPhil in the 80s with Shumit Sarkar, Clifford Geertz was very, very important. Now, what's very significant, I think, over there, whether it's thick description or deep play, I think it is less the Parsonian influence, and it's more the fact that going to Gilbert Ryle, Geertz is bringing in the aspect of webs of signification. And I think what cultural and social historians found then was the absence, in some senses, of, when we looked for structures, when prior generations looked for structures, when they looked for larger abstractions, what was missing were the meanings of social actors. Okay, so I think in important respects, Goethe's emphasis on the webs of signification in which social subjects were bound was very significant for understanding the place of meanings, the place of understandings, of apprehensions which social actors bring into their practices. Now, this is one part of the story. The other part of the story is that what was missing from Goethe's analysis was he emphasized meaning, but where was power? Where was authority? Where was alterity? Where was difference, right? Culture seemed bounded. He wrote so elegantly that all this was neatly tucked away very often in the flow of his prose, but power was missing, and it's something which I'm going to emphasize. But what was missing as well was the fact that cultures are not as bounded. What was missing as well was the fact that even when Goethe turned to history, somewhat later in his life, in Negara, his book on the theater state in Bali, there was a certain idea of history, of temporality, but it was entirely static. There were no transformations. It was like culture. It was given. It was like a Balinese shadow theater, basically. So thank you very much for asking these questions, because I would have liked to elaborate more on these in the talk, and I can't, but hopefully what I say will generate more questions, including, about the work of William Roseberry, who pointed to the limits of Goethe's work, suggesting that we need to look at questions of meaning. But we need to relate meaning with power, that we need to understand questions of political economy together with questions of culture. And that's his book on coffee and culture in Venezuela. And I never met Clifford Geertz, although I think my father sort of had met him at a conference. But I have very fond memories both of Kathleen Goff, who very nicely, very sweetly would recall how, as a 16-year-old, I had bought her a little elephant from Bastar, which my mother had carried to her in Vancouver. And she cherished that little, the Dokra Bastar-style elephant. And William Roseberry, who actually had dinner with us in the neighborhood we are sitting in now, but in another house in Coyoacán in Mexico City, 2 or 3 years before he died, a very early death. So thank you very much. It brings up personal, poignant memories.
Nice to hear. We want to know about something about your Delhi days, basically. Basically, your experience with Professor Sumit Sarkar when you were going through your MPhil degree. You have your MPhil degree from Delhi University under his supervision. So
yeah, so it was both the masters and the MPhil, actually. And I mean, again, there's a little personal story here which relates to my professional life. I was very nervous and really not good at exams. I mean, I was nervous. I didn't do that badly. I got my first divisions in BA and MA and so on and before. So I did get my first divisions, but I was terribly nervous. So, after my BA honors, which is set from St. Stephen's, where Tanika Sarkar also taught me, I was pretty certain that I'd be a happier creature. I'd be a happier being if I moved to JNU, right? Because they don't have exams. They have term papers. And I was better at term papers than I was at exams. Besides, term papers didn't generate the kind of nervousness and anxiety which exams did. But then, I talked about this with Tanika Di and with Vichamida and with other teachers who are going to be there, such as Vijay Singh in European history. And I was convinced that if I wanted to stay in social history, including my interest in combining history and anthropology, and the sort of larger critical ferment which was going on in cultural social history of the time, it was known as social history, in around the debates on subaltern studies, I would be happier. I'd be better off. I wouldn't be happy with the exams, but I'd be better off staying on in Delhi University. So that's on how I stayed on, in Delhi University. And that's how I did my MPhil, which actually initiated my first large body of research on the Satnamis, in which Professor Shimla was extremely supportive. And as he was, he was interested then, we're speaking about roughly the mid to later 1980s. He was himself in that period deeply interested in questions of social cultural history, his work on time, but also his work on Ramakrishna Paramhans and so on and so forth. So, it was a very exciting time, actually, both working with Chimidda, but in the larger context, and being in Delhi University, it was an invigorating time, with not just with subaltern studies and the debates around that, but also in terms of the strike in Delhi University. We often forget, the processes of democratization which were going on among college teachers. So it was a fabulous time, and I'm just happy I stayed on in Delhi University and did manage to get that first division in the end. Does that help?
Another question, just to know, starting from untouchable past, and through the journey through the modernity and even unbecoming modernity, when you reach to the Dipesh Chakraborty and the Global South, what do you feel about this journey?
What do I feel?
What do you feel about your journey? About your journey through your books, through your own books, authored books.
Kaushik, you're very kind, but you're making me feel old, I mean, I still like to think that there is a journey ahead, It's not as if I've sort of reached some kind of closure. No, but thank you. It's a very important question. I think some of the questions about, some of these questions about the modern and modernity actually started with working with the MPhil, the PhD, and the book Untouchable Past, which is which is on some of the audience may know, many may not, which is in a very untouchable and heretical caste sect in Chhattisgarh, a large heretical caste sect in Chhattisgarh called the Satnamis. Now, my initial interest was in trying to explore the ways in which resistance, which is really important for subaltern studies, could be expressed in a religious idiom. In other words, not that there was a deep kind of social political reality and then there was religion was this kind of expression of something at the bottom, but how caste and religion structured forms of resistance, negotiation, historical action, practices of a subaltern group. Now, as I worked on this, including on the myths and so on, I'm quite interested in the fact that, and some of this I'll speak about today, that, history is not just chronological. History is not just what the historians say. People themselves live history in particular ways. There are different forms of historical consciousness. Alongside, I realized something else. Alongside, I realized that, subjects such as the Satnamis were not behind modernity somehow. There were not these traditional beings who had religion, and then there was this modern or modern, modern subject. It was about the fact that modernity, in a hazy way, as I read on Christianity and colonialism, as I read the work of Anne Stoller, of the Komarovs, as I read more and more in anthropology, I realized that these were subjects, that modernity itself needed to be understood as a historical, cultural process. And, and groups, subjects such as the Satnamis were parts of these processes. They made these processes. So this is where it started. And I must say, yours is a very important question, because I think what happened was the move in 1995 to Mexico made a lot of difference, because, that's when I realized questions of modernity were in some senses deep in the agenda, particularly from the late 1990s in Latin American scholarship, what came to be known as the coloniality of power decolonial turn. And there was a critical engagement with modernity then. And I must say that, there were important provocations which came from scholars such as Dipesh and Partha Chatterjee, and there were other works going on. But the critical engagement with questions of the modern and modernity were deeper, right, in Latin America. So that led to a certain kind of curiosity in my mind, and it led to the volume which you mentioned, Unbecoming Modern, which is not actually, my work is not a rejection of modernity. That's much too easy. It's too facile that you just, very often it represents a kind of an romantic anti-traditionalism, or actually the anti-traditionalism of someone whom I've admired a great deal and to whom Unbecoming Modern is dedicated, Ashish Nandi. His what he calls critical traditionalism is actually a form of anti-modernism, which is itself very modern and which has existed for the last 2 centuries. We often forget these genealogies, and I'll be touching on them. So what is happening basically is that I realized that, the subaltern subjects I worked on, including converts to Christianity who were Adivasis and Dalits, including figures entangled with systems of colonial justice, but also village law. These were they were not modern subjects, but they were subjects of modernity understood as a process. And this led me also to question the idea of a singular modern subject. Why do we think of the modern subject as European, as advanced, or the Indian or Chinese from Shanghai who looks like the European modern subject, right? And why is this modern subject typically male? So I like jazz, and I understood that 2 of the quintessential 20th century modern subjects were actually my favorite musicians, Billie Holiday and Miles Davis. But why is it that we think of the modern subject as a European one? So, what I'm trying to point towards is there were a whole range ways in which the questions went. And you can see in the very ways in which I'm raising these questions, beginning with provincializing Europe, a return to rethinking history. The Dipesh volume happened because Dipesh had been a long-standing critical engagement with Dipesh's work. It's not just celebration. I would like to call it a critical celebration of his writing. So that's how, what you call the journey. But I hope it is
journey. I think Arinda would like to comment on this.
Sorry? It's just actually, before I forget, we want to hear you more from your lecture. But before I forget, I like to point out that please tell us something also on the particular journey of history and anthropology, and the question of considering culture as a text, because this is a very, very important thing. And in your discussion, we want to hear more on this. And also, that generally anthropology is going on the synchronic line and history in the diachronic line. And the synchronic and diachronic, how they can combine and can produce something more, so that we can get both Clifford Geertz and the very good aspects of William Rosebery together. Because we are actually very much interested in Geertz, and as well as William Rosebery's critique on him, and the point that we have made, that this question of power, the question of power, etc., all these things, and the social and cultural formation, whether it is out of our discussion or not, everything is in mind or something outside the mind. That is also a question. And I think that you'll discuss some of these questions in your lecture in order to get more lucid account from you, because these are actually haunting us. And we want to get good answers from you on the subjects which are haunting us. So let us hear
thank you
Professor
very
Saurabh Dube, and I think that will be an enthralling experience.
Well, thank you. So, thank you again, Professor, for that, because some of the questions which you're bringing up are the ones which I allude to, which I touch upon, but which are more resonances in my lecture. The idea of culture as a text, for example, the experimental ethnography which came up in the 1980s. As you'll see, it's I wouldn't like to call it a bird's eye vision, but it's a long-term vision which I offer, which I think is necessary, especially in relation to the other important issue which you raised about synchronic and diachronic. What I want to talk about in the lecture, and I think we can return to some of these questions, because perhaps it's time to start the lecture soon. But the synchronic and diachronic is, rather than saying there is a synchronic and there's a diachronic, and I want to actually ask in the lecture, where did the synchronic and diachronic begin? I want to question some of the common sense notions of whether they should be considered as separate at all. And what were the mutual presuppositions, both of history and anthropology, which led to their being separated in particular ways, especially in the first half of the 20th century. So basically, the story I'm going to account which I'm going to recount, and hopefully it comes off well, is one of crisscrossing pathways rather than a straight line. And there are many convoluted turns. There are many, there are many blind ends which we'd read, which is as it should be the case, because the story of disciplines are not heroic histories or heroic ethnographies. They are stories of blind ends. They are stories of contentions, of contradictions, of they reflect actually the mixed up, murky nature of the social worlds in which we live. Right? So I thank you very much. I'll come back to
just
some
proceed
of
with your yes, sure. Just proceed with your lecture. With permission from the chair, I would request you with the history, anthropology, and rethinking disciplines. And now it's all stage is yours, Professor Saurabh Dube.
Thank you. No, thank you for the generous introduction, as well as this lovely adda with which we began. It is a pleasure and privilege. It is a pleasure and privilege to deliver this talk. I thank SUCHI and its organizers for the invitation. The talk is based on a rather long 70-page, 18,000-word essay forthcoming in the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Anthropology, due out from OUP, New York, early next year. Clearly, I've had to cut and prune the text, especially leaving out the close to 40 pages of references that shore up the essay. So I just hope that my efforts work. In discussing together history and anthropology, it is often acknowledged that the relationship between the two has been contradictory and contentious, but that their interplay has also been prescient and productive. At the same time, Such considerations are premised upon framing anthropology and history as already known, taken for granted disciplines. Here, each prefigured inquiry is seen as characterized by its own desires and methods concerning research and writing, analysis and description. Arguably, what is required is a distinct disposition to the subjects of history and anthropology, their tensions and intersections, their contentions and crossovers. And these distinct dispositions to the subjects of history and anthropology actually exist in the archive, in the genealogies of the disciplines of anthropology and history, but they need to be culled out carefully, cautiously. First, to juxtapose anthropology and history is to rethink these inquiries, sieving them against the grain of their formidable disciplinary conceits. Second, such tasks require exploring the constitutive linkages of the two, of history and anthropology, with wider processes of meaning and power, of the Enlightenment and Romanticism, empire and nation, race and reason, and hermeneutic and analytical procedures, as well as with broader transformations of the human sciences. These reveal curious connections as much as mutual makeovers, especially when mapped as careful genealogies and critical poetics of anthropological and historical knowledges. Third and finally, at stake are bids that stay with and think through the received configurations of culture and power, the traditional and the modern, and space and time, based on the shared sensibilities of anthropology, history, and orientations such as post-structural and post-colonial perspectives, decolonial and subaltern studies. All of this makes possible the tracking of incisive articulations that are empirical and theoretical of subaltern formations and historical conceptions, colonial cultures and imperial imperatives, gender and sexuality, nation and state, slavery and heritage, and alterity and modernity, each on the cusp of anthropology, history, and their intersections with the human sciences. Now, if the imagination and writing of history are often traced back to classical antiquity, a similar claim can be made about the pursuit of anthropology. At the same time, this talk charts a different course. To start off, I consider the common grounds of anthropology and history as institutionalized inquiries formed in the second half of the 19th century. Yet I do so only while looking back over my shoulder to delineate prior intellectual political currents going back to the Enlightenment, Romanticism, and their byways, which have continued to shape later terrains. This sets the stage for the principal focus of the talk on the elaborations of anthropology and history as modern knowledges from the 20th century onwards. Here, I stay away from singular readings grounded in the present, which plot the paths of the disciplines, including their mutual makeovers, in tendentious and teleological ways. Actually, such eschewal on my part is itself premised upon a deciphering of texts and times through readings that contextually construe continuities and contradictions, ambivalences and excesses. Taken together, such measures can hopefully unravel a few of the consequences of critically juxtaposing anthropology and history, from their mutual presumption to their disciplinary distinctions to their contending conjunctions. Not as a straight line, but as crisscrossing pathways. Arguably, the common grounds of anthropology and history as modern inquiries rest upon enduring oppositions between static traditional groups on the that is savage people or native communities on the one hand, and dynamic modern societies, that is civilized states or European orders on the other. Now, this point has been made in relation to anthropology, but I want to say that this distinction between static traditional groups and dynamic modern societies is at the core of history writing as well, a great deal of history writing as well. Evidently, such a duality and its distillations have undergirded also other antinomies between, for example, ritual and rationality, myth and history, community and state, magic and the modern, emotion and reason, and East and West. At the same time, the pervasive dichotomies have found diverse values and shifting expressions both in modern knowledges and among the discrete subjects that the distinctions and disciplines have named, described, and objectified over at least the past 3 centuries. Taken together under consideration are not only disciplinary knowledges, but commonplace understandings and the ways in which these terrains of disciplinary knowledges and commonplace understandings come together while they also fall apart. Allow me to begin with the European Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries and the accompanying processes of the secularization of Judeo-Christian time. Now, rather than an exclusive enlightenment, I'm speaking here of rather more plural enlightenments, not merely on empirical registers, but in critical ways. At stake were distinct expressions of universal and natural history alongside contending strains of rationalism in, say, France, and of empiricism skepticism in, for instance, Britain. There were key challenges to analytical procedures through a severality of counter-enlightenments that shaped the Enlightenment. And there was at work the consequential idea, yet a circumscribed and limited process of such secularization of Judeo-Christian time. And procedures of the secularization of Judeo-Christian time as at once an emergent and consequential idea, yet a circumscribed and limited process. After all, the Enlightenment, broadly understood, involved the reordering of philosophy and the remapping of history. It was not just about philosophy, it was about the reordering of philosophy and the remapping of history, the reworking of human reason and the replotting of human nature. At stake was the wider rethinking of man, civilization, and nature, a rethinking in places where biblical assumption continued to cast its light and shadow. On the one hand, despite the critical contentions among such schemes, they nonetheless frequently projected different developmental images of universal history. This is to say that from the rationalist, progressivist claims of Voltaire and Kant through to contending historicist frames of Vico and von Herder, projected forthwith were grand historical designs of civilization and culture, of Europe and nation. On the other hand, the tension-ridden knowledges never simply coalesced in order to intimate a uniform Western or Enlightenment mentality. Rather, they pointed towards the face-offs between analytical and hermeneutic orientations, between developmental and historicist imaginaries, and between progressivist and romanticist dispositions. Together, the interplay of these tendencies across the first half of the 19th century underlay the institutionalization of anthropological and historical knowledge in the second half of the 19th century. Alongside the wider, contending but overlapping dispositions to human worlds have continued to inform ever since the uneven unraveling of anthropology and history as modern inquiries, including the excesses of meaning that the disciplines have been unable to contain, let alone shake off. The sociocultural evolutionism that characterized characterized British anthropology from the 1860s brought together two separate prior tendencies. And I cite Stocking Jr., George Stocking Jr. here. On the one hand, a study of the variety of mankind, that had yet to free itself from the constraints of biblical assumption. And on the other, a study of the progress of civilization for which a positivistic program was already well established. This conjunction itself turned upon the erosion of the intellectual defenses of anti-evolutionism, the decline of biblical anthropology, and the increasing legitimacy of naturalistic apprehensions of human variety. Now, the key question to be explained was that of the development of civilization, especially the unequal participation of different subjects, of different races, of different ethnicities in its what was projected as civilization's inexorable progress. Thus, it was in this way that linear and progressive time formatively entered the core of evolutionary anthropology and its racial assumption, frequently shoring up temporal sequences and hierarchical stages between the savage and the civilized. To be sure, Victorian anthropologists betrayed their own differences and distinctions, as becomes clear from considering the persuasions of Edward Tyler, Herbert Spencer, Henry Maine, and Lewis Morgan. But together, they purposefully, tendentiously raided the historical past, or what they thought was the historical past, in order to elaborate a vehement episteme of meaning and power, relying on their naturalistic, progressivist, developmental articulations of civilization, but also its elisions. Biblical assumption had distinctly, this is important because we somehow think that the world became secular in the 17th, 18th century. But this is not really true, as we should know from our current present and the place of the evangelicals there. Biblical assumption had distinctly shaped diffusionist ethnology and comparative philology. Diffusionist ethnology and comparative philology, which were joined at the hip by the imaginings of the Tower of Babel from the Bible. So biblical assumption had distinctly shaped diffusionist anthropology and comparative philology in their search for the unity and variation of humankind through the linkages of history, language, customs, and mythology. Not unlike sociocultural evolutionism, the formative presumptions of these orientations were now challenged by the archaeological revolution of the 1850s and the rise of the biological evolutionary paradigm. All this underlay a variety of challenges to sociocultural evolutionism, including those bearing affective resonances of the Romanticist tradition, especially of a German kind, of a German provenance, now in newer configurations. I turn here to a single exemplary critic of evolutionary anthropology. As the 20th century dawned, Franz Boas defined anthropological knowledge as consisting of, I quote him, the biological history of mankind in all its varieties, linguistics applied to people without written languages, the ethnology of people without historic records, and prehistoric archaeology, unquote. This was broadly in keeping with wider ethnological assumption, and Boas added to all these inquiries across his career. At the same time, for Boas, the otherness, which is the subject matter of anthropology, was to be explained as the product of the change of time, an insistence on the diachronic that covered also his unifying definition of the discipline. Before the end of the century, before the end of the 20th century, Boas had offered a neo-ethnological critique of the comparative method of classical evolutionism. This critique insisted upon specific historical inquiry, detailed linguistic investigation, and grounded physical anthropology. But before we get carried away and start celebrating Franz Boas, at the same time, Boas's work is better understood as straddling the dualism between progressivist and romantic traditions, interweaving universalistic and rationalist orientations with particularistic and emotional dispositions, as at once entwining and holding in contrapuntal tension these contending schemes of modern knowledge. The intrepid anthropologist Boas had built a form of inquiry that principally freed itself of racial biological determinism in order to point toward a disciplinary conception of culture as relativistic and pluralistic. Yet, this turn to the diachronic, the historical, and the temporal was mostly ignored by anthropology across much of the 20th century. Turning to history, its professionalization in the second half of the 19th century equally expressed the contradictions and contentions of modern knowledges. At stake were discrete claims on civilization and culture, shaped by class and race, nation and empire. To begin with, important strands of history writing representing historicism, especially instituted as a discipline in Germany, bore a double-sided relationship with universal human progress. Expressing hermeneutic, historicist, and counter-enlightenment impulses, such histories acutely articulated notions of culture, tradition, and the folk, principally of the nation. They did so to interrogate the conceits of what they saw as an aggrandizing reason, as well as the developmental schemes of philosophical history that were understood as leitmotifs of the Enlightenment. This could allow for relatively relativistic and pluralistic understandings of cultures and nations. At the same time, following the influence of Leopold von Ranke's avowals of source criticism, the official archive, and historical narration as telling it the way it really was, classical historicism reinforced the exclusive designs of singular histories, designs that turned on a decidedly non-cosmopolitan, divisive nation and its statist power politics. The documentary dispositions and the philological methods underlying the historicist principle of continuity, meant also that most non-European others were banished from the canvas of history, discreetly animating thereby the antinomies of modernity, the primitive and the civilized. In sum, going back to the compelling influence of Herder on historicism, we find at once the possibilities of pluralist and relativist imaginaries and the presence of nationalist and racialist presumptions. So you have both the possibilities of pluralist and relativist imaginaries and the presence of nationalist and racialist presumptions, putting a particular spin as well on hermeneutic dispositions, analytical orientations, and their conjunctions. Moreover, the elaboration of the historical discipline elsewhere in the Euro-American world in this period meant that history writing not only bore the flag of the nation, but it carried the impress of empire. Here, the proximate pasts of dark terrains, mainly colonial territories, frequently appeared as footnotes and appendices to the ur-history of Europe. And the extending frontiers of the historical imagination in settler colonies, the United States, for example, but also Mexico, and the extending frontiers of the historical imagination in settler colonies orchestrated their primitive subjects through civilizational allegories. Finally, the modern histories construed in colonized countries and emergent nations, India and Peru, for example, were not merely replications of blueprints out of Europe. They imbued instead their accounts with particular protocols of proof and method, truth and philosophy. But these accounts of the past were also often envisioned in the image of a progressive European civilization, albeit using unto their own purposes the hierarchical oppositions of Western modernity. The institutionalization and contentions of anthropology and history as modern inquiries emerged after the wider processes of the French and Industrial Revolutions, the French, American, and Industrial Revolutions, as responses to changes in class structures and the revolutions of 1848, and alongside the consolidations of nations and empires. These developments informed also broad streams of social thought, from Marx to Durkheim to Weber to Freud, or Freud to Weber, figures that were to have a significant impact on history and anthropology in the 20th century. Indeed, Durkheim's influence was critical in the makeovers of both anthropology and history during the interwar years. At the turn of the 20th century, the anti-evolutionary impulse in anthropology was manifest both in the influence of Franz Boas and the implications of diffusionism. Now, the emergence of fieldwork-based scientific anthropology under the auspices of Bronislaw Malinowski and A.R. Radcliffe Brown was premised upon a break with the speculative historical procedures of diffusionism, of culture as being diffused across the world, even as Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown bore a more ambiguous relationship with evolutionism. This is often forgotten. They didn't have a clean break with evolutionism. Theirs was a more ambiguous relationship with evolutionism. The functionalism of Malinowski and structural functionalism of Radcliffe Brown put a question mark as such on historical procedure. The contradistinction between the work of anthropology and the labor of history in these paradigms bore the influence of Durkheimian sociology, such that the privileging of synchrony over diachrony presupposed that social orders were best apprehended in abstraction. It presupposed that social orders were best apprehended in abstraction from their historical transformations. Here, the disciplinary emphasis on tracking continuity and consensus to the neglect of change and conflict in societal arrangements was premised upon a sharp distinction. It was premised upon the opposition between non-Western cultures held in place by myth and ritual and dynamic Western societies grounded in history and reason. All this has wide implications. Especially for anthropology at large. Johannes Fabian has argued that anthropological inquiry has repeatedly construed its object as its constitutive other through measures turning on temporality, such that the ethnographic object stands ever denied the simultaneity, the coevalness of time with the instant of the anthropologist subject, the anthropologist studying the object. Here, the historical time space of the observing modern subjects and their society, alongside the taken for granted objective time of scientific knowledge, the historical time space of the observing modern subject and their society emerge as always ahead of the mythic time space of the observed object and their tradition. Anthropological analytics and narrative techniques project a lasting ethnographic present. The ethnographic present never ends. And change and transformation usually enter native structure in exogenous ways. Such protocols underlie the savage slot, what Michel Rolf-Trouillot called the savage slot, and what I modified as the native niche of anthropology. The savage slot and the native niche of anthropology that have been formative of the discipline. This is not to deny that such disciplinary schemes have been attended by exceptions and challenges. Yes, they've been attended by exceptions and challenges, issues to which I will return. The point is that beyond the influence of evolutionist understandings on contemporary anthropology, at stake are pervasive modern metageographies that carve up social worlds into enchanted terrains of tradition and disenchanted domains of modernity. The problem is larger than just of anthropology and history. The crisis of classical historicism and the narrowness of history writing, their preoccupation with politics in the shadow of the nation, meant that from the early 20th century, there were attempts to found the historical discipline on scientific principles, as well as to redress the hitherto residual role of society and economy in the historian's craft. For our purposes, special importance is occupied by the Annales school of history writing in France, which in the 1920s made a decisive break with event-based political history. Drawing on sociological considerations, particularly the work of Durkheim, the Annales suggestively, imaginatively opened up the scope and subject of history writing to draw in processes of society, economy, and culture. Now, while registering the importance of such departures, at the same time, it is equally important to resist the persistent tendency that casts the Annales as gradually expanding social cultural history, thus leading it to eventually embrace anthropology. Here, we need to cautiously consider what was foreclosed by the foremost formative structural histories of the Annales, as well as to probe their implicit oppositions between backward communities and civilized societies. These return us to the common hierarchical antinomies concerning time and space that link anthropology and history as modern inquiries. Meanwhile, the simultaneous presence of progressivist and romanticist tendencies in the modern human sciences meant that imaginative endeavors could critically engage dominant disciplinary designs, yet they could also emerge as constrained by the wider metageographies of modernity. Consider quickly the work of the anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard on time and space. Here, the entwining of hermeneutic impulses and analytical tendencies imbue Evans Pritchard's considerations of time and space among the newer peoples of Africa with their motive force and their critical limitations. His hermeneutic renderings unravel the creation in activity of concrete everyday time-space among the newer, thereby founding the temporal and the spatial in the image of social diversity and cultural heterogeneity. At the same time, simultaneously, following Evans Pritchard's analytic assertion, the newer people entirely lack long-term time, revealing lasting projections of non-Western primitive places and Western modern spaces. Evans Pritchard's exemplary work bears linkages with a wider rethinking of the principal predication of social action on sociological structure within functionalist and structural functionalist paradigms. Did not counter-colonial movements, nationalist struggles, and other practices of colonized subalterns during the interwar years reveal a certain discrepancy between classical functionalist apprehensions of social action and the emphatic agency on non-Western subjects? There were diverse shifts within British anthropology after the 1930s. From the efforts of the Rhodes Livingston Institute in Southern Africa to move the locus of ethnographic inquiry to proletarians from tribes, through to the emergent interrogation of functionalism within British anthropology, especially its Manchester mutations, which explored anew social conflict, individual action, and collective processes, particularly from the 1950s. Such efforts could not simply shake off the long shadow cast by functionalist schemes, but they were also not innately opposed to the work being undertaken by social historians at the time. Indeed, here were attempts to think through the autonomy of analytical traditions, which could include wider reconsiderations of the discipline. The last included Evans Pritchard's famous endorsement of anthropology as a humanistic inquiry, not a social scientific one, as well as his assertions of the intersections between anthropology and history. Here were varied efforts to grapple with the shifting paths of anthropology, to respond to wider political and historical transformations affecting the discipline and its subjects, and to extend received disciplinary blueprints. Such bids also characterized anthropology in the US after World War II. At least three tendencies emphasized the significance of diachronic and historical understandings for the discipline. But I must leave the work of Robert Redfield, of Eric Wolf and Sidney Mintz, and of the field of ethnohistory for the discussion, as also the work of William Roseberry, which came up during the Adda. The point now is that the terms of temporality remain principally at a remove from the textures of the discipline. And the discipline frequently presented culture as essentially coherent and bounded, autonomous from power relations and societal transformations, and inward-looking as it turned on itself. This was true of the work also of Clifford Geertz, which otherwise opened up possibilities for articulations of anthropology and history. The long 1960s witnessed civil rights, anti-imperialist, radical student, emergent feminist, and continuing anti-colonial endeavors across the world. Did not such processes implicitly indicate the discrepancies between anthropological projections of invariant, unchanging structures and cultures on the one hand, and emphatic assertions of human action and history making in wider worlds on the other? At stake, especially, were critical explorations across different disciplines of the interplay between structure and practice, rules and processes, social structure and historical action. Consider, for example, the work, and I'm just speaking of the top of my mind, the work of Pierre Bourdieu, Anthony Giddens, Philip Abrams, among many, many others in the 70s. The emergent forms of an anthropological practice distinctly attended to the temporal textures of culture and subject, meaning and structure, social reproduction and societal transformation. Indeed, history was making urgent claims upon anthropology. Engaging the archival record, important ethnographic writings focused on non-Western subjects as critical attributes of the contradictory elaboration of colonialism and capitalism, themselves understood as temporally and culturally layered fields. This revealed, too, the sustained interchanges between Western and non-Western worlds. There were no bounded non-Western cultures. Being questioned were anthropological objects of inquiry as insinuating bounded, being questioned by anthropological objects of inquiry as insinuating bounded and coherent entities based on antinomies between traditional orders and modern societies. Simply put, the conjoined emphasis on process, practice, and power went on to reinvigorate the study of disciplinary staples such as religion and ritual, magic and witchcraft, symbolism and law, and kinship and kingship. At the same time, the emergence of an anthropology of Europe from the late 1970s had complementary consequences. The anthropology of Europe queried rarefied distinctions between the West as theory, self, and the non-West as object, other. And it pointed to the ways that not merely social processes, but anthropological analyses are enacted in time and space. The changing fate of culture brings home such reconfigurations. For the terms of culture were now shown to contain within themselves dominance and dissonance. That is, projections of seamless, static cultures bracketed, excised authority and alterity, of community and gender, race and sexuality, shaped over the last 5 centuries by colonialism and capitalism, nation and modernity. Unsurprisingly, the critiques of the culture concept have been taken forward in distinct directions in recent decades. And some of this was what Professor Bandyopadhyay was alluding to in terms of culturist text. But there are other variants too. And it has become evident also that rather more than a mere analytical device, culture is a critical resource within the imaginings and practices of the very people the notion has variously sought to define and describe. Culture is important, is critical from the fourth world to the first world, from impoverished indigenous peoples to privileged ethnic constituencies, from violent religious militants to dominant holders of power. All speak in the language of culture. There's nothing innocent about culture. Unsurprisingly, these emphases have followed upon wider historical developments. The end of innocence of the Bandung era as newly independent nations revealed their authoritarian and corrupt designs. The retreat of the institutionalized visions of state-sponsored equality with the fall of the Berlin Wall. The rise and decline of the magic of unfettered capital and the Midas of the free market. And the more recent ascent to power of plutocratic and populist regimes that avow entitlement while raising walls of different descriptions. Meanwhile, the gradual expansion after World War II of the historical discipline included an increase of professional specialization and job opportunities. Now, the elaboration of important trends in social cultural history from the 1950s were part of common attempts focusing on subjects marginalized from the historical record, including the wider democratization of history writing. The influence of anti-colonial imaginaries and the Soviet invasion of Hungary, the civil rights movement and the reckoning with Nazi past, the energies of 1968 and the mobilizations against the Vietnam War all played a role here. Considering the paucity and perversity of the historical record of subaltern subjects, here were bids to seek out distinct archival materials, read them with newer eyes, and think anew their validities as sources of history. This equally resulted in dialogues with anthropology, but also with other disciplines, including sociology, demography, psychology. The new forms of historiography carried critical possibilities, but also their own limitations. I have in mind major traditions that have included the third generation and after of the Annales School in France, the erstwhile British Communist group of historians, historians of African and American slavery in North America, the collective subaltern studies project focusing on South Asia, pioneering social cultural histories of Europe, microhistory or microhistoria in Italy, and Alltagsgeschichte, the history of everyday life in Germany. Now, rather than tracking these tendencies in a Whiggish manner as necessarily increasingly opening out to anthropology, it might be more useful to ask questions of their possibilities and problems. That is, the way these historiographies principally extended the terms of the disciplinary coupling of history and nation under modernity. At the same time, how these departures were also unable to break with such lasting bonds, to escape their long shadows readily, easily. The productive ambiguities of these traditions have been followed by an even wider opening of new cultural histories. And so, towards the end now, I turn to the shared renovations and mutual entailments of anthropology and history over the past 4 decades. Such makeovers have been severally influenced by the shifting political context of the last 4 decades, the linguistic and cultural, but also the ontological and affective turns in the human sciences, key crossovers with anti- and post-foundational understandings, and acute interchanges with post- and decolonial perspectives. Here, archival readings and critical fieldwork have at once supported and probed each other, querying also the fetish of the field and the purity of the archive in order to rethink the disciplines of anthropology and history. Alongside, these tendencies have been severally influenced by imaginative interrogations of modern disciplines and their abiding antinomies, of lasting legacies, querying of lasting legacies of historical progress, and of persistent projections of a rarefied Europe and a palpable West as modernity, history, destiny for the world at large. At this point, rather than segregate the disciplines, it is more useful to track the contemporary confluence of historical anthropology, ethnographic history, and cultural paths. To begin with, the newer emphases of historical anthropology, alongside critical histories of subordinate groups, have led to key explorations of the identities and endeavors, meanings and practices of subaltern peoples and marginal communities. Such subjects have appeared as active participants in wider processes of identity in history, colonialism and empire, nation and nationalism, state and citizen, and modernity and globalization. All this is well known to the present audience. And so I turn to how the critical rethinking of historical writing as a historical consciousness has come to lie at the core of newer scholarship. There has been emphasis on the socio-spatial plurality of cultural paths, the manner in which history and temporality are distinctly apprehended and severally enacted by particular social groups. These emphases have been equally accompanied by a recognition of the place of power in the production of the past. The uses of history and their contending validities, which include the constitutive politics of historiography as bound to the very nature of the academic historical archive. Taken together, at least 3 critical yet convergent emphases have come to the fore. To begin with, diverse admissions that forms of historical consciousness vary in their degree of symbolic elaboration, their ability to pervade multiple contexts, and their capacity to capture people's imaginations between and across social-spatial groupings. Moreover, salient suggestions that history does not refer only to events and processes out there somewhere, but that history exists as a negotiated resource at the core of shifting historical worlds and subject formations. And finally, urgent reminders not only of the coupling of modern history with national imaginaries, but also of the haunting presence of a rarefied West in widespread beliefs in historical progress. And this amidst the pandemic. It follows that historical representation has been found as being made up. It follows that historical representation has been found as being made up of overlaying yet contending protocols of meaning and power, time and space, the oral and the written, the genealogical and the national, and dominance and difference. Alongside bids to articulate the past have combined the desire, to prudently probe and carefully narrate social terrains with the impulse to critically articulate and cautiously affirm them. Based upon the interplay between anthropology, history, and related critical perspectives, another set of crucial explorations center on colonial cultures of rule. At stake are challenges to overarching representations of colony and empire. Such scholarship has explored the practices, representations, and boundaries of settler peoples, imperial agents, and evangelizing missionaries. It has revealed not only the crucial dividing lines between different colonial agents, missionaries, and administrative agents, diverse imperial agendas, but underscored that such conflicting interests and contending visions could often drive a single colonial project. Moreover, there have been close analyses of the relationship between the metropolis and the colony, the mutual shaping of European processes and colonial past. From the manner that the impulses of empire and their reworking in the colonies brought about changes at the heart of Western history, through to the ways in which there were conjunctions and contradictions between bids to discipline subject groups at home and efforts to civilize subject populations in the colonies. Third, there have been imaginative analyses of colonial processes as shaping the margins and the metropolis, processes that turned on space, time, language, the body, and the law. Imperial travel, exhibitory orders, museum collections, colonial representations, and material exchanges, culture, consumption, art, and literature, and gender, explorations of gender, sexuality, race, and desire under empire. Fourth, several significant studies in this genre suggest the importance of the interplay between historical representation, political economy, and state formation. Fifth, nuanced understandings of culture and power have emerged, bound to remind us that gender and sexuality structured formations of empire and of nation. Finally, there have been incisive explorations of the colonial experience in the making of the modern world, especially the linkages between Enlightenment and empire, and race and reason, alongside a rethinking of the disciplines considering their linkages with colony and empire, as well as with gender and nation. It follows that understandings of empire have been accompanied by analyses of the nation in this newer scholarship. There have been prescient challenges to pervasive projections of nation, nation-state, and nationalism as expressing primordial patterns and innate designs. Although among the most consequential institutions and imaginings of recent times, nations and nationalisms have appeared as social artifacts and historical processes, variously displaying attributes of what Benedict Anderson famously called imagined communities. On the one hand, astute studies of the processual construction of nationalisms have tracked their fabrications and fantasies, entailing not only pedagogy and performance of the nation, but also scandals of the state and citizen. On the other hand, there's been keen recognition that such patterns and procedures of power are not merely ideological errors, but critical facts of social worlds, facts that bear densely worldly attributes. Together, the pedagogies and performances of nation and state inhere in their quotidian configurations, even as these performances and pedagogies unravel striking varieties of disciplinary power, spatial temporal imaginaries, cultural cartographies, and racial ethnic cleansing. Clearly, the figuration of nationalisms and nations as dominant projects does not occlude their formative distinctions. As part of wider fields of counter-colonial politics, subaltern endeavors often accessed and exceeded middle-class and elite nationalism, expressing thereby a supplementary politics of the nation. At the same time, middle-class anti-colonial nationalism articulated their own difference by translating European democratic traditions in transforming Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment principles. They sieved thereby the images and ideas of the sovereign nation and the citizen subject through forceful filters of the subjugated homeland and the colonized subject. Such difference and distinction further marked the presence of gender and sexuality as shaping dominant and subaltern nationalisms. And so too, alterities and identities of state and nation appear as bearing intimacies and contentions with transnational imperatives and global transactions. Makeovers of historical anthropological inquiries have emphasized the requirements of rethinking modernity, modernism, modernization, and the modern. In place of exclusive images, analytical abstractions, and formalist frames that attend these notions, the divergent articulations of modernity and contending expressions of the modern have emerged as attributes of crisscrossing yet particular histories and cultures, times and spaces. At the same time, exactly such diversity, its vernacular and plural character, arrive as already influenced by likenesses of an imaginary yet tangible Western modernity. So, rather than invocations of alternative or early or multiple modernities, at stake are explorations of modernity and its subjects human and non-human. At stake are explorations of modernity and its subjects, human and non-human, as simultaneously shaping and shaped by contradictory and contended processes of meaning and power. Heterotemporal spatial procedures that are incessantly articulated, but also out of joint with themselves. In the 21st century, salient strands, I'm coming to the absolute end here. In the 21st century, salient strands of sociocultural anthropology appear to have gradually, principally pulled away from histories and archives. This is a question which itself requires discussion. At the same time, critical studies are meaningfully articulating the terms of heritage and history, construing anthropologies of Christianity that point towards ethnographies of the secular, and offering histories that variously explore formations of slavery and race in the production of the modern world. And so, at the end, we return to where we began. On the one hand, the dichotomy between the primitive and the civilized that define the beginnings of history and anthropology as modern institutionalized inquiries seems to have been left behind by salient strands of critical knowledge. On the other hand, the antinomy and its implications between the savage and the civilized, the antinomy and its implications, especially unraveled as hierarchies of otherness, continue to haunt our worlds at large. A point that hardly bears emphasis in the ruins we inhabit. Trump's shithole countries, anyone? What might be considered as the tasks ahead? First, there is more at stake than the demarcation of specialized fields such as historical anthropology or ethnographic history, and for that matter, history of anthropology or anthropology of history. Rather, to explore together history and anthropology is to stay with and think through their presumptions and productivities as disciplines of modernity. Moreover, and disciplines cuts different ways here, the meaning of disciplines. Moreover, this means registering the limits of splitting apart the knowing subject from its object of inquiry, in order instead to consider them conjointly, often uneasily. Here, my reference is equally to accounts of emergent worlds made and unmade by precarities and pandemics, the non-human and the Anthropocene. Emergent worlds in which analytical optics and their entities of knowing come to inhabit mutual frames, illuminating and interrogating each other. Finally, all of this implies eschewing pervasive performances in academic arenas of the novelty of the author's analyses. To do so in order to be vigilant, rather, of the burdens of the past. It is in these ways that we can better respond. It is in these ways that we can better respond to the probing quotidian questions that are said to have punctuated Maurice Merleau-Ponty's seminars. He would interrupt his seminars by asking, "Where are we? What time is it?" Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Dube, for a wonderful talk and for a magnificent survey of the two disciplines of history and anthropology over a long time, at least more than 150 years till now. And there may be certain observations and certain questions, but before asking those questions and those observations, I would have a little bit of comment and observations and one or two questions also. The first and foremost observation is this, that I fully endorse Professor Dube's magnificent survey in the sense that these two disciplines, their similarities and their differences cannot be understood unless and until we make a disciplinary study of those disciplines. This is a very, very important thing. And though actually when this effort was made, it was a sort of a juxtaposition, and there were certain consequences of this juxtaposition. But over and above all, finally, we reach to some rethinking on man, on civilization, and on nature, as far as these two disciplines are concerned. And I'm not going into the details of the various very important arguments of how the master figures of these two disciplines gradually developed their ideas, their prejudices, their limitations. This is the story of the disciplinary history of those disciplines from the 19th down to the 21st century. But at the same time, I think that there are certain very important questions and which are not immediately resolved. For example, the questions how time and space, these two very important terminologies as well as important themes have been understood by, explained, explored by these two disciplines, history and anthropology. This is a very, very interesting point. Time and space. Initially, the certain kind of opposition to making an entry of time in certain kind of anthropological studies, and then how time peeps in. Similarly, space. Space is one kind of thing in history, and space is another kind of thing in anthropology. So these two things are very, very important thing. And secondly, one very important conclusion that Professor Dube actually brings from his magnificent survey. Indeed, actually, as you are told, that it was 80,000 page, 80,000 words actually survey, and then it has been summed up, and then it is further summed up in this 1 hour lecture. So we have come to many aspects, but we have missed also many things. So the another very important conclusion, I think it needs a little bit of clarification and further expansion, that how anthropology, Professor Dube is saying that finally emerging as a humanist inquiry and not as a social scientific one. This is a very, very important one, because social scientific one was more or less history's destiny. From a humanistic discipline to a social science discipline, history emerged over time. And anthropology, which is actually etymologically meaning that there was definitely man-centered, and it becomes more and more a humanistic inquiry. This is a very interesting thing. And with this, all these questions of culture and other things that we are discussing are coming in. And this is a very interesting answer that Professor Dube has given regarding the question that, with the question with which we began the Adda, that how culture is to be taken both in history as well as in anthropology. And there is one way to see it as a text, there are many other ways also. But he refers to a very interesting concept, culture as a critical resource. This suggests, this particular word critical is very, very important one. That means there was simultaneous, continuous interference of thought, action, and many other things. This critical resource. And at the end of it, I think because he began this entire journey with the magnificent history of these two disciplines. So at the end of the journey, whether how much of their similarities and how much of their differences, at the end of the journey, he actually points out certain problems and possibilities. Because these problems and possibilities suggest that these two disciplines, they have their core areas and they have their combined areas. And they are continuously moving. And any kind of movement cannot be complete unless there are problems, and how to face those problems, and indeed resolving those problems, repostulating those problems are actually summed up in possibilities. So finally, these two disciplines, actually the juxtaposition story and then the individual story of these two disciplines, the so-called core areas and the combined areas, and finally the two disciplines actually are posed with certain problems, and they had to develop certain possibilities in order to be live disciplines of today. So in this way, actually, I can sum up the magnificent talk that Professor Dube has given. But some of these questions, as I told you, will remain. Like one was on particularly this time and space. Another was on the particularly rethinking, very important thing, and the third one was the consequences. So these are some of the observations and questions, but there may be certain other questions which I think has been maybe posed by others, and maybe there is the chat box where these questions would be given, and Kaushik will definitely coordinate these questions, other questions.
So in the meanwhile, should I respond to you, Professor Bandyopadhyay?
Please.
Is that, yeah. So, thank you very much for those comments. Yes, what I'm suggesting is, the turning the tools of history and anthropology in the study of anthropology and history, but less as just a disciplinary study, but more as a kind of a critical genealogy of history and anthropology, a rethinking of these disciplines, which questions their taken for granted assumptions, but also their conceits. In a very everyday sense, history and anthropology seem to be divorced from real worlds. What I want to do is place them in those networks, projects of power in which they've always been embedded. That was the larger part of it. That the Enlightenment was not something which is merely an abstraction, which is a kind of a background, but the Enlightenment, Romanticism, colony, empire, nation, impact on the ways in which these studies have been shaped. So there is, in that sense, if there is what Dipesh calls a cloister of the discipline of history, it emerges within wider frames, its autonomy. This gets me to the second point, which is a very, very important one, which you raised, about time and space. Now, there are these understandings of time and space in history and anthropology. Very often they are taken for granted in these disciplines. Time is taken as something, which is unfolding. Space is given as something which is exterior, which is already there. Now, against that, they've been important. Questionings of these notions, including in history and anthropology. But what I want to get at is, and this is something which I discuss in my last book in English, Subjects of Modernity. I think time and space, rather than being taken for granted as already there, as a kind, the terms of an unfolding or as a kind of time and as a kind of a backdrop, I think we need to understand time and space as created, as produced in everyday activity. Okay, this is what was referred to as the social production of space, but it is also about the cultural construal of time, and space and time then emerge out of everyday activities. When I was speaking, and I was worried about getting over the 1 hour which Kaushik had given me, I was producing the anxieties of space and time within myself, right? Space sitting in front of this place, and time, as I was enacting time. So there's the everyday articulations of space and time, but these everyday articulations exist with the hegemonic construals of space and time, which is when we speak about, for example, the East and the West. We are speaking of an East which is behind, spatially and temporally, than the West, right? Or in New Age understandings, an East which is ahead of the West. When we are speaking of the primitive, of the savage, of the native, we are speaking of temporal spatial coordinates already, and these are about the hegemonic aspects of constructions of space and time, which are also everyday. When for example, when Calcutta or Delhi are sought to be made like London, it is about the hegemonic and everyday construal of space and time. And we often forget that, space and time are not just out there, they're very much a part of us. And it's there that I want to go actually to the third dimension, that what you can look at, and this is what I try to do in Subjects of Modernity, is how there are epistemic construals of space and time which you can trace in anthropology, which bring together different traditions, different kinds of inquiries, different ways of specifying, for example, what is authority, power, capitalism, modernity, what is difference, alterity, the subaltern, right? And and what this means is that the subaltern or difference or alterity are not merely behind now, but they are ahead of power, of dominance, because they question them. So this is the epistemic construal of authority. And this gets me to the final very important point which you made. When I spoke of anthropology as humanistic inquiry, it was Evans Pritchard who was speaking about it, and he turned very religious, and I like that, Evans Pritchard. But it brings up the larger question of, it seems to me actually that, and thank you for pointing this out, then despite their claims of being social sciences or humanities purely, or of a certain transition, actually, if you look at the flux and flow, the balance of history and anthropology, they have always combined in different ways the social scientific and the humanistic. And this goes back actually to there being modern knowledges, being disciplines of modernity, in the strict sense of disciplines, in the following manner. The social scientific I'm attributing in some senses to how they seek to be analytical. The analytical as based on the idea of logic, so that, details are important only in as much as they tell a larger story. And then there is the hermeneutic. The hermeneutic as based on, not on logic, as based on mathematics, but the hermeneutic is based in the reading and unraveling of texts, right? Carefully, where the details are really important. Now, in some senses, the hermeneutic and the analytical come together in major traditions of knowledge. And if we look at the larger schemes, I think we find the hermeneutic and the analytical working through the writings of, through the writings of Marx, but also Heidegger, of Freud and Weber. We find them in Lucien Febvre and Marc Bloch. We find that hermeneutic and analytical in Evans Pritchard, and before him, Franz Boas. So in a larger sense, we might think of, of social sciences, we might think of history and anthropology as, in wider frames, as always being made up of those conjunctions of social sciences and humanities, and humanistic inquiry, in terms of the larger interplay between the hermeneutic and the analytical. I mean, it's surprising, how people who claim to be entirely analytical can move towards, hermeneutic tendencies, and those who claim to be principally hermeneutic, talking about ethics, for example, can turn so social scientific in terms of being analytical. And for me, I'm not solving a puzzle. I'm just interested in how these disciplines themselves connote worlds which are worlds to understand, because they are worlds connected with the worlds in which we live, the worlds of power and meaning. So in some senses, I'm bringing a certain kind of historical and ethnographic sensibility. I was born in academe, right? Not to academe, but born in academe. I couldn't have survived, I couldn't have survived this if I wasn't doing field work all the time, particularly in academe, particularly in the disciplines. but fieldwork combined with archival inquiry. Archival genealogies. Sorry. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Thank you. And I think that there may be, Kaushik may be collecting some questions. Sure. Kaushik, are you here?
He wrote me a note.
Kaushik?
Okay. It was an excellent presentation, sir, and excellent discussion going on already. Aruna has already pointed out some important things, and now we have Prantosh Bandyopadhyay. Sorry. He asked that Vidyasagar stood by the Santals since 1873 and took remedial measures or atrocities against them. Is he the pioneer anthropologist in South Asia?
I'm sorry, it can't be 1973. I'm enough of a historian to know.
No. He has already
okay,
corrected
fine.
the thing.
Yeah.
So, is he the pioneer anthropologist in South Asia? What do you think? Asked by Prantosh Bandyopadhyay.
Well, I mean, thank you. It's a very, it's a tricky question, but it's also an important question because, because what do we mean by pioneers? I would take the term, I would turn the question around as I do with most things, which is ask the presumptions around the question. Who are pioneers? Where is the term pioneer come from? Who were the pioneers in the American West who destroyed, the lives and lands of native, of indigenous peoples? So I have a certain problem with the term pioneer itself, particularly being used with indigenous peoples. And this gets me to the point that, we can, of course, try and find, beginnings everywhere, but who, consider the contradiction that as a disciplinary inquiry, anthropology in India began as an entirely colonial project. And these were people very well described, for example, in Amitav Ghosh's first book. They were measuring peoples, the heads of indigenous people for size. So what was that objectifying relationship? That's the beginning of the disciplinary aspect of anthropology. There were those who stood by, such as Vidyasagar, for the Santals. But, I would like to ask, going back to the work of Pratima Banerjee, on what are the ways in which the Bhadralok understood the indigenous? Or are we to see pioneers in the perfection of Vidyasagar? What were the attitudes, 19th century, 20th century attitudes of the Bhadralok towards, towards the Santals, towards the indigenous? And there might be hidden, occluded histories here of other kinds of settler nations, other kinds of settler colonies. So, I cannot, I'm actually better at leaving people with more questions than answering them. But, of course, it's also the case that we can choose to find, the pioneers we wish to. I'm not into the business of seeking out pioneers. There's a new question. Should I read it out or what's happening? Can you hear me?
Please answer the question. Yes.
Yeah, but
you can see the question.
Okay, so I'll just read out the question because I need to make sense of it. The particular event of long past described with the discourse circumscribed in 100 years ago is totally different from today. The discourse prevailing described the event consequentiality. The power with its ideology dominates the synthesizing the historical event. the description of historical consequences sometimes widely differ on different strata of society due to wide difference of conscience at every level. Multiple factor influence description, particularly in oral historical process. I can't agree or disagree because I don't completely understand what's being said. But, as a larger kind of meta-narrative about the past and the present, I would agree with you, Mr. Banerjee. Yeah, so I'll just read it. This is a question from Iman Rodur from Department of Archaeology, University of Calcutta. Iman Rodur, sorry. His question concerns the discipline of archaeology, which is considered somehow the subdiscipline of both anthropology and history. And so what is archaeology's place in today's modern world as a subdiscipline of both anthropology and history and its own right as a discipline? Thank you very much for the question. It's a really important one. So I must, in my own self-defense, in the larger text, in the first footnote, I have a large number of qualifications of what I'm doing in the essay on which this talk was based, the one on history, anthropology, and rethinking disciplines. And one of the points which I make, one of the points is, of course, I'm not taking worlds such as those of Russian Empire and China and so on, and what happens to the picture. I think that would introduce differences, but if you actually begin with the late 19th century, sorry, I'm using your question to bring in some of my qualifications, but if you begin, in the late 19th centuries, I think the imperatives, maybe not of empire, but of nation, which influence disciplinary processes, there would be differences, but there would also be something of cross exchanges between, say, the worlds of China or Russia or Turkey with and their empires and national projects with what is going on. We tend to think of these histories were entire separate, but these were, in some senses, critically conjoined, or as Sanjay Subramaniam would put it, as connected histories, although he's speaking of an earlier period. Now, going to your question, this is the other qualification which I make. I really couldn't go into the question of archaeology, which has been absolutely central, whether we think of empire or whether we think of colony or we think of nation, whether we think of disciplinary development. So, how do we deal with, there is the figure of Moses Finley, for example, who straddles history and anthropology with a remarkable influence over there. So, in some senses, I couldn't go into the question, but the way I would like to answer it now, to address it, is less in terms of a meta answer about anthropology, whether it's a subdiscipline of anthropology and history or its own right, but in terms of how archaeology is being articulated across history, anthropology, and archaeology, in their admixtures. And what is crucial here, as you would know, I'm sure better than I do, is in what have emerged as heritage studies, right? And heritage studies have taken off after the 1970s. And interestingly, what defined heritage? We think that heritage has always existed, but actually it was. Actually, it was the decision of the UNESCO in the 1970s to start looking for heritages, and this led to a larger explosion of heritage as something wider. And what heritage studies do is really combine fieldwork, archival inquiry, and archaeological excavation to look at the worlds made and unmade by heritage, how the very idea of heritage is lived, how the very idea of heritage is performed, how the very idea of heritage oppresses, how the way in which it occludes. So, the let me come up with a little story. I've been coming up, I've spoken too much in terms of abstract arguments, which I've tried to make concrete. But here's a story. I visited Nalanda for the first time. Okay, I visited Nalanda for the first time in 2017, early 2017. As we were at Rajgir, at Nalanda University, and went to Nalanda. And I confess to being absolutely horrified. I confess to being absolutely horrified by the way in which they had taken the structures and built, with new bricks. Now, what was the imagination there? This is archaeology. This is everyday history. This is history, and this is anthropology, ethnography in everyday ways. What had gone in the making? You would have all seen pictures of Nalanda at any rate. So what is at stake where you override, go over, obliterate the entire prior structure, except one small portion, and build these large red walls, which replicate how the structure must have looked. This is the contemporary, everyday practice of archaeology, which is mediated by who? By, I think, babus and politicians sitting in Patna and elsewhere who decided in local public space, in local picnic space. Sorry, I'm turning to Hindi. But, so it was the creation, the way in which heritage is enacted in everyday spaces. And what I'm trying to say is that archaeology here intervenes as an everyday practice in the giving, in the making of heritage spaces, which are actually spaces for picnic. And this has been my entire point. We should not, I'm glad you asked this question, that anthropology and history are not just these disciplinary inquiries which are far away. They inhabit our everyday worlds, as does archaeology. I hope, this example made some sense.
Iman has another questions. Second question is how combined methods of anthropology and history are useful to understand the geopolitical issues through temporal and spatial aspects.
Well, it's a very big question, but I think in a sense, that's what I've been trying to say. There are geopolitical issues which are of the contemporary present, which are, let's say, the relationship between China and the United States, what Putin is doing. That I am not entirely conversant with, in the sense that I read them in the newspapers. So I don't know if you mean that kind of geopolitical issues, but in as much as geopolitical issues of time and space concern nation and empire, in as much as they concern Enlightenment thought and Romanticist dispositions, what I've been speaking about is that it's not just the combined methods of history and anthropology, it's actually the genealogical rethinking of these disciplines, which helps us bring into, which helps us grapple what was our past, what went into the making of the disciplines we study. And so this is not a specialization for me. This is not something which I specifically research on. I do it as a part of my practice of working on Christianity and colonialism, for example. It's a part of working on Dalit and expressionist art. It's a part of my project on everyday, on entitlement and affect among my own classmates and elites in Delhi. It's not a specialized field. We always need to look back over our shoulders to ask that question. Where are we? What time is it? We cannot take these things for granted. And it's what the anthropologist and my friend who died very young, Michel Rolf-Trouillot, said, we have to overlook the contemporary arrogance we have, contemporary arrogance of our own times, that we are entirely unique. We are not that unique, except for the particular ways in which Nalanda was destroyed. I think that kind of maverick behavior is something which is a part of our nationalist presence.
Richard Chakraborty asks, what is the importance of feminist cultural anthropology in ancient world as well as the contemporary world?
Well, how do I answer this? I think feminist. I don't know very much of feminist cultural anthropology as it has been practiced in the ancient world, but I think it's really important in terms of the kinds of, it can have significant implications also in the study of archaeology, going back to the earlier question. It certainly is very, very significant in terms of asking questions. For example, if you think of the work of Donna Haraway, it's very important in thinking of the presence, for example, of the non-human, how we are actually imagine worlds in ways which are entirely anthropocentric, which center on the human, which would be one way of bringing in the non-human or the more than human. And some of this is what feminist practice has brought into, not just cultural anthropology, but I think, Richa, at some stage, you should be practicing feminist cultural anthropology and maybe even bring together the study of the ancient world with the contemporary world. The only way I'd be able to really answer this question was if I was an oracle. I'm not. So, I've said there are certain pointers which I can suggest. And I hope you do take up research, which critically extends feminist cultural anthropology, Richard.
Basically, when you were saying that what are we, what time is it, I was remembering your writing about Maurice Merleau-Ponty's seminars. In that particular, you have also argued about the contemporary arrogance, that celebrates the uniqueness. Do you think that when you were saying that history of anthropology or anthropology of history, to explore together history and anthropology, the importance of as disciplines of modernity, do you think there is a possibilities of many more subjects combining, which is, we can say, multiple way of thinking, multiple way of thoughts, multidisciplinary approach, like that way? But do you feel any particular other subjects, other disciplines to be attached with, to be explored with?
The very invocation of within two sentences of the contemporary arrogance comes from, as I just said, from Michel Rolf-Trouillot, and he was an anthropologist from Haiti who's written this fabulous book called Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History. And that presents not just of a Haitian anthropologist, he was very elite, by the way, but not just of a Black Haitian anthropologist, but of someone, who represented the French tradition, was, I think, very, very important, because these are the cross-cutting genealogies we often forget, in our Anglophone worlds. And what was very significant there was the questions, Michel Rolf-Trouillot was asking about slavery, for example, and the making of the modern world. Now, why is it that we forget slavery, although our own countrymen went off as parts of indenture to the, because they went to Fiji and they went to Suriname and they went to the West and to the what came to be known as the West Indies, and that they were not around. That the significance of slavery. Now, why am I bringing this up in relation to your question? What I'm trying to say is that when Trouillot wrote about these questions of the presence of slavery in the making of history and the modern world, he was drawing on traditions of literature. He comes from a very distinguished family from Haiti, where he says history and literature inhabited the family dining table. And he was initiated into both. So when he writes about slavery, when he writes about anthropology, he writes out of history, he writes out of literature. Okay? But the other person I brought in was Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who's of course a philosopher. But but this is not about using his name to make a big point about. He had wonderful things to say about space, but it's not to bring in Maurice Merleau-Ponty in relation to as a kind of as a kind of a guardian deity in order to make a theoretical point. I'm just speaking about how philosophy can interrupt the way in which we speak. So that, when Maurice Merleau-Ponty used to ask this question, where are we? What time is it? He was interrupting very abstract discussions in his seminar. He would suddenly stop and say, where are we? What time is it? It's that moment that philosophy also is not something distant. It's not an abstraction. It's not something you show off with. Okay, it's something which has to be enacted in terms of this question of the abstract discussions are necessary, but so also that interruption. Where are we? What time is it? And my entire bid in some senses, and this is to answer your question, the different subjects, the disciplines, is about how we make them our own. It's not just about these things which are these kinds of resources which you bring in to say, I combine philosophy and I combine cultural studies and I combine, or as Trouillot's work has influenced, critical Black studies. I combine this and I combine that. That's like showing off. It's what do you do with the stuff? How do you make these traditions your own in order to ask meaningful questions, not just about the disciplines where we are removed from the world, but to ask about how the disciplines and the worlds meet each other. Is that helping? As I said, I'm better at questions, raising more questions than coming up with answers.
No, absolutely right. True indeed. Basically, very important thing I want to mention it about your lecture. These are the things I believe that there are so many students who has not at all any idea about this sort of thoughts, this sort of thinking, what to think about the subjects as disciplines or how to deal with this. So as part of our organization and organizational activity, this is one of our achievement that we have started discussion on this type of theme. But I do feel that in a lucid way, it is very important to make some specific books available for these students. For like today, Imon and Richa has asked, these are integrating really, but this is very important. So, do you have any thought of writing for students particularly? Because what I basically felt, your writings is not reaching toward the students here. I'm talking about, in fact, talking about Calcutta.
Again,
It is,
that's
yeah. It is
that's
again
not,
surrounded among the elites.
I will take that question not as criticism. I'll take it as a fact of life. No, seriously. I mean, yes, yes, I'm trying to. I'm not going to defend myself. Yes, I'm sorting through certain kinds of things, and certain kinds of questions, and I try. As I go along, I'm trying to write in ways which are more accessible, but sometimes we have to, even as we question the things taken for granted, if we start explaining, every term which we describe, this lecture would have gone on for 4 hours. I mean, I realized as even before I was speaking today, that I needed to explain, for example, evolutionism. People might have known, but what is diffusionism? I didn't explain it, but we make our choices, and here, thank you for giving me this opportunity for speaking, and for Iman and Richa for reaching out and asking these questions, because ultimately what I'm trying to do is plant certain kinds of ideas, plant certain kinds of questions. And, what I can say is that things are not reaching out. I can't change what I have written and the ways I've written it. But, one thing I've tried to do, Kaushik, Professor Bandyopadhyay, is not look at royalties. I mean, how much royalty do you earn in writing books? So I have done something. I hope my publishers are not listening. I put up every publication of mine on academia.edu. And I think of it not as, not as a measure of success. I think of it as in these profoundly unequal worlds of ours. I think about academia.edu. I don't know about ResearchGate, although my younger friends are helping me with that. But what academia.edu is an intellectual commons. Okay, so I would actually say that this the essay on which this talk is based is present on my academia.edu page, and if people are interested and they want to go back and get something else out of it, including questions of archaeology, even needs to know that I have a longish discussion with references on the questions of the emergence of heritage studies towards the end of it. On feminist anthropology, to Richa, I would say it runs through the critical import of rationalism, of feminism runs through it. I didn't want to say it because, I didn't want to do the thing which professors usually do or academics usually do, which is to say, I have answered these questions in my larger text. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to answer it, I think, like say, I think, in academic worlds, there's too much pretense and posturing, man. We don't laugh enough. We're not real enough, So my point about that is that they are present in, for example, the academia. And believe me, I treat it as an intellectual commons, and it's really important. It's really important where not just my stuff, but I put my edited volumes, so I have a book called an edited book called Enchantments of Modernity. And this is wonderful paper by someone called Navida Khan, who's an anthropologist, who's from Bangladesh, but that's not important. She lives in the US. Navida has this fabulous paper on the martyrdom of mosques. Now, the mosques themselves become martyrs. What happens then to Buddh Parasti? Right? To the worship of to not, to completely rejecting the worship of idols, if the mosque itself is a martyr, which means a Buddha. Okay, now here's the thing. I'm suggesting that you read the article, but what's fabulous is that I don't get to find out which article is read in that book, but the number of times Enchantments of Modernity is read in different parts of Pakistan and even in Afghanistan, in Iran. Where would this happen without an intellectual commons? So, this is partly in relation to your question.
Absolutely right.
We do what we can do. And this is, this in some senses is about looking at the inequalities that exist. When my stuff in Spanish, when my own books and edited books are read in Bolivia, where there's striking poverty. Okay, when they are read in Sierra Leone, okay, the ones in Spanish, actually, also English, when they are read there, there is something which is going on. So, I cannot be, just as I don't believe in pioneers, I don't believe in being a vanguard. I'm not. I know my place in the world. So, what
No,
I
sir.
can do, I do.
No. Professor, here is a particular Professor Dube, as you have already written too many books in Spanish itself. So at least we can ask you for the same what you have wrote for Oxford in Hindi. It can be done.
I have
I think
written in Hindi. I've written a couple of essays. One in a volume which came out actually in 1993 from Vani Prakashan, which was a popular piece.
Okay.
The book is called Ayodhya aur Uske Aage. It was a volume which was intervening in the controversy around 1992, and I actually went back to the past of Ayodhya, and these are pasts which were overlooked by. It was the contentious, multiple pasts, the contradictory ones, which you find from everyday accounts, which were entirely obliterated by discussions. I mean, Niladri Bhattacharya referred to some of them, but the work of anthropologists such as Peter van der Veer and Richard Burghardt on the making of Ayodhya in the popular imagination, I was surprised, actually. I was very surprised. So it was an article about that. I was really surprised that none of this entered the Supreme Court judgment. I mean, I don't trust all the judges, but I would have thought that the younger Chandrachud, might have some understanding of this stuff.
Chandrachud, yeah.
What I'm going to say is the everyday aspects of it. So Hindi, yes, I wrote that. I was invited to write, and I feel gratified about it. On Dalit Strivad, on Dalit feminism, there was an issue on that, a special issue of this journal in Hindi, and I went back to my work on the Satnamis. But honestly, Kaushik, I am unlike my mentors and my teachers from Calcutta, Arthada and Deepesh and Gautamda. I just don't have that facility. I think and I think it's a generational thing. Coming 12, 15 years after the generation of Midnight's children, because I'm married to Ishita, whose Bangla is fantastic, but even she, her spoken Bangla is fantastic, but she doesn't write in Hindi. My spoken Hindi, even if I say I'm told, is very, very good, but I don't write in Hindi. I mean, I can, but it doesn't come naturally, right? So I'll tell you another thing. I always bring in the personal with the professional. There's no separation. I'm sorry, but they make for interesting stories. So I decided, talking about the Hindi thing, I decided that I was going to translate. We know the three generations of Bhishma Sahni, his daughter, the writer, his daughter, got to know them very well at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, and they considered Sheilaji, Bhishmaji's wife, considered Ishita like a daughter. Bhishmaji really liked me. So there was him, and then the next generation, which was Kalpana, their daughter, but also Romi, her husband, and then the next one, and now there's the fourth one, Martin. So we know the three generations, and then I decided, we're sitting and having coffee or something, and I said, Vishnuji, I'm going to, at their house, as I'm going to translate, your memoirs, which is, or I'm going to translate some book of yours. No, it was some other book. And I tried from Hindi to English. And, I realized how difficult it was. And Vishnuji, of course, said, Saurabh, tu apna waqt kyun zaya kar raha hai? Why are you wasting your time? Don't do all this. You do your own stuff. So I took my lesson from that. There are things we can do. There are things which we can't do. What I am, what I feel gratified about, or today's language, people would say, I feel blessed about is that when Bhishmji's memoirs were coming into translation, not in original when they were coming in, I suggested the title, which was Aaj Ke Ateet, which has been translated. So I do, the little bit, I could suggest a title, I couldn't translate as well. We have to be aware of our capabilities. But, has it helped what I've answered?
Yes.
Definitely, yes. Arunda.
So,
Arunda, please unmute. Arunda, you are not audible. Arunda, you are not audible, please. Arunda, you are not.
Yes.
Now,
Yes.
Yeah.
Now.
Yeah. Now you are audible.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Now.
Yes.
Okay.
Absolutely
So,
audible. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Saurabh Dube, for your excellent talk as well as very animated discussion that you have done for us, the lay persons. We have learned a lot about this interesting journey of history, journey of anthropology, as well as the genealogical aspects of it. And thanks to the questions raised from the floor, particularly of course, the digital floor, and also from Kaushik Saha, that you have become personal at various points of this talk. And this is an advantage for us, because actually when you say something personal, I think that we are closer to reality, because abstraction is very good.
True.
And without abstraction, we cannot live even actually but abstraction with the personal memory of it, personal aspects of it, becomes something very important and something very enlivening. And as a result, this 2 hours 27 minutes, our this symposium, this webinar was extremely interesting, and it was never boring, and it was always something in which we think that we try to participate. Particularly Professor Saurabh Dube, thank you Kaushik Saha and SUCHI, and thank all the participants who have participated. And I am sure that when it will be put on the YouTube, more and more people will see it. Already, I think many persons have seen it, listened to it in the Facebook, and I heard that it will be put on YouTube and it will be placed. And I think students will be enriched by it. And the question that Kaushik raised, that how actually this type of knowledge, this type of discussion, this type of explanation can reach to the... Actually, you have mentioned elite. I do not like this, because who is elite? Any person who actually is engaged is an elite. And in that sense, that if a person is engaged with it, whether it is in the Facebook, whether it is in the classroom, whether it is in writing some rejoinders to the author, he is an elite. Everybody is a thinking person. So in that sense, actually rethinking the entire core story of Saurabh's discussion is rethinking. And I think he has been successfully been able to encourage us in this rethinking. Thank you. Thank you, Saurabh, and thank you all.
Thank you so much. And I'm sorry if I didn't answer all the questions as well as I would have liked to. I'm sorry for that. But thank you for the questions and thank you for this invitation. I really, as you might have seen, I really enjoyed my time here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All
Officially, a thank note already has been given by the our today's president, Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay. Thanks a lot, Professor Arun Bandyopadhyay, too, and Professor Dube. And just an announcement, on 29th, there is another lecture of organized by SUCHI, SUCHI উর্নাময়িক আলোচনা চক্র নবম, যাতে বলবেন অধ্যাপক স্বাধীন সেন, বাংলাদেশ থেকে বলবেন প্রফেসর স্বাধীন সেন। তার বিষয়বস্তু তিনি বলবেন প্রত্নতত্ত্ব এবং ইতিহাসের বোঝাবুঝির সম্পর্ক নিয়ে তিনি বলবেন, হিস্ট্রি অ্যান্ড আর্কিওলজি, এই দুটো ডিসিপ্লিনের, অন পার্টিকুলারলি on Bangladesh archaeological excavations of northwest Bengal, Bangladesh, উত্তর পশ্চিমাঞ্চল এবং মধ্য অঞ্চলে যে বাংলাদেশের পরিপ্রেক্ষিতে তার কিছু কোশ্চেন জিজ্ঞাসা, সেগুলো নিয়ে তিনি বলবেন। অধ্যাপক স্বাধীন সেনের সঙ্গে আমরা 29 তারিখ পূর্ণাময়িক আলোচনা চক্রে আবার মিলিত হব। সূচির কার্যকরী সমিতি এবং সমস্ত শ্রোতা দর্শকদের সকলকে আমাদের তরফ থেকে ধন্যবাদ, অনেক অনেক ধন্যবাদ প্রফেসর দুবেকে। থ্যাঙ্কস টু প্রফেসর দুবে। অসংখ্য ধন্যবাদ অরুণদাকে। অরুণদা অসম্ভব সুন্দরভাবে আজকে পরিচালনা করেছেন এবং আমাদের আরো ভাবনা চিন্তাকে, what I have said, the rethinking, really rethinking, and we have enriched with that particular term itself. এবং আমি শেষ করছি একটাই কথা বলে, যে এলিট কথাটা সত্যি অরুণদা ঠিকই বলছেন, যে যারা যুক্ত হতে পারে তারাই এলিট হয়ে উঠতেই পারে। এলিট মানেই কোনো বিশেষ সম্প্রদায় নয়, সেটা বোঝানোর জন্যই হয়তো আজকে যেভাবে ডিজিটাল ওয়ার্ল্ডেও এগিয়ে যাওয়ার চেষ্টা হচ্ছে, এগিয়ে চলা হচ্ছে, সেটার মধ্য দিয়ে যে ছুঁয়ে যাওয়া যাচ্ছে, এটা একটা আমাদের সার্থকতা। কিন্তু সেই এগিয়ে চলার মধ্যে আমি এটাই শুধু বলবো যে আমরা যেমনি চেষ্টা করছি, দিনের পর দিন আমাদের অধ্যাপকরা, আমাদের মাস্টারমশাইরা, তারা চেষ্টা করেছেন। আজকে প্রফেসর দুবে, প্রফেসর অরুণ বন্দ্যোপাধ্যায়, তারা যে ভাবে এগিয়ে এসছেন, তারা তাদের পূর্বসূরিদের থেকে যে ধারা পেয়েছেন, আমরা আমাদের পূর্বসূরিদের সেই ধারা নিয়ে যেভাবে এগিয়ে যাচ্ছি, সেই ধারা, সেই উত্তরাধিকার, বারবার বলবো, সেই উত্তরাধিকার বহন করার জন্য আজকের যে জেনারেশন, তাদেরও এগিয়ে আসতে হবে। তাদেরকেও সেই আজকে যে ভাবে বারবার করে, দিস ইজ রিয়েলি ইম্পর্টেন্ট, থ্রু দিস ডিজিটাল প্ল্যাটফর্ম, students and teachers communication has extended in a different way, different world. You must, I mean, to the students, you must make it more effective, more productive. Thank you all. Thanks a lot. Good night.